In Part 1, we saw how the railway began its life and observed its early days under track power. In Part 2, I started constructing my own locomotives and abandoned track power for battery and deltang radio control. In Part 3, RC trains took over for a while, and the infrastructure of the line developed. We have now arrived at 2019, and will see how the line has reached maturity and how new technologies are beginning to influence its future direction. Throughout 2018, new sidings were appearing around the railway. As you will have seen, operation and freight handling are something I really enjoy about running my railway, and so Lineside Industries are very important. At Beeston Castle, William France and Son have established a thriving coal merchants business on the newest siding. The names of all the business owners, station staff and passengers on Peckforton Light Railway are drawn from the census returns for the area. At the other end of the station, on the old siding, we now find Beeston Brewery. Every half-decent railway must have a brewery, or so I've been reliably informed. This one was constructed from PVC foam board, carefully scribed with bricks. The windows were designed and 3D printed for me by a fellow modeller. Far more elegant than I could have produced by hand. I was very impressed. Just below Beeston Castle, on the approach to Bickerton Station, another new siding now serves the sand quarry, which is located just off-scene. There was an extensive sand quarry at Beeston Market. I have just shifted it a few miles to the other end of the railway. The loading hoppers are mostly constructed from foam board, my now preferred modelling material for buildings. The embankment behind was cast in concrete. The hopper wagons are based loosely on those which served on the Snail Beach and District Railways. The hoppers were constructed from plasticard, with a couple of hundred nail art gem rivets glued on by hand. The chassis were adapted from Heartland Loco Works mini-series wagons, which I had acquired from my mate Greg in Australia, as they were surplus to his requirements. Alas, Heartland Loco Works is no more, but as we shall see later, I have created an alternative. Although, as you have seen, I am a great fan of deltang radio control, I have not closed my mind to alternatives, especially if they work out cheaper. For a while, in 2019, I experimented with Bluetooth control, using a free phone app and Arduino components. For around £10, I was able to get my phone and/or my tablet computer to control one of my locos. Although I was impressed with the level of control available, I was less impressed with having to peer closely at my phone screen whenever I wanted to do something. And so, I experimented with a few other components and made a transmitter, similar to my deltang versions. The results were quite pleasing, particularly when I combined the receiver with an MP3 player module for sound effects. However, I couldn't replicate the level of fine control and the stability of deltang equipment. But I haven't given up hope yet. I had been using an LGB toy train diesel for my experiments because its body simply clipped on and off, making it easy to change the electronics, but it couldn't stay as it was. I kept the overall structure the same, but titivated it a bit to make it less toy-like, adding fly cranks and dozens of nail art gem rivets. I'll admit she is not the most attractive-looking loco, but I can't help wondering if it's something which might have emerged from the mud of the front-line trenches after the Great War. While tidying up the cupboard under the stairs, I came across my trusty old Scion pocket computer. Not only did it still work, I found I had remembered how to program it, and so I replicated my freight handling program on it, and can now carry it around while running trains without having to keep referring to computer printouts. And finally, towards the end of 2019, I decided it was time I had a decent workshop. I ditched plasticard and foam board in favour of pressure-treated softwood, but like all my scratch-bash builds, it was designed in my all-purpose workbook and constructed by my own fair hands, though it did take a little longer than this video clip suggests. Equipped with power and lighting, it provides me with a haven where I can store all my junk and make as much mess as I like without upsetting other members of the household. P.S. Do you remember those days when we could go visiting people? During 2019, I made a trip into the wilds of South Wales to visit my friend Peter Butler and take a bit of video of his wonderful Brockhampton and Umbridge Railway. Peter was one of my first RC Trains customers, and we have remained in touch ever since. 2020 will go down in history as an extremely memorable year for all of us. But on the Peckforton Light Railway in 1932, the Spanish flu epidemic was a dim and distant memory. Life on the railway continued very much as usual, but behind the scenes, significant events were taking place. Well, it all started after I decided to finally get around to constructing the kit for an ex-Cloger Valley Railway Walker railcar, which I had acquired a few years ago. At the Llan Fairgarden Railway Show, I persuaded John Campbell to prepare and send me the etchings for his Walker railcar kit. He did warn me it was a bare-bones kit, with none of the resin or white metal parts which accompanied the full kit, but undaunted, I pressed on. Although I've never constructed an etched brass kit before, I set to work. The roofs were carved from basswood, and the radiator from plasticard. But when it came to the seating, I faltered. How could I produce 28 identical seats for the interior? I considered making my own resin castings, but then I happened to see an eBay listing for a new 3D printer for £70. By the time I bought it, it had gone up to £80, and a week later it was just over 90. Supply and demand, I suppose. I wasn't sure if I'd bought a pig in a poke, but when it arrived it looked okay, and once I'd assembled it, to my surprise and delight, it worked. Using a free program, SketchUp, I duly drew the seats and printed them out. That worked. What next? Early on in the year, I had decided to widen Buckley Station, to squeeze in yet another siding behind the main line. I hit upon the idea of creating a boneworks for this new siding. There had been one in the area, so I decided to move it to Buckley, to provide another, slightly unusual Lineside industry. I based my model on the bone and flint mill at Etruria. It was a far more attractive building than the ramshackle collection of corrugated iron structures near Beeston. Built from foam board, its windows were drawn in Tinkercad, which I had found to be a lot easier to use than SketchUp, and printed out, together with downspouts and guttering. The Etruria bone mill was, and still is, powered by a beam engine, and after discovering a kit for one on the Thingiverse website, I printed out the parts and assembled it. I was really enjoying the 3D printing experience, but then I do quite enjoy tinkering about with technology. Of course, the beauty of 3D printing is that fellow modelers can share their drawings freely with the rest of us, and so for a while I was happy to download and print out things I needed, but which others had produced. But the fun for me is in creating my own models, and so, having got to grips with Tinkercad, I turned out a few fairly simple items which were on my to-do list. And then I shifted my attention to rolling stock. As Heartland Loco Works, who produced the chassis for most of my goods stock, had ceased production, I was forced to create my own alternative. I replicated the open wagon bodies I had mass-produced with resin castings back in 2009, and then discovered I now had the skills to produce my own chassis. Well, this opened up all sorts of possibilities. As a long-term fan of the Southwold Railway, for which no one has, to my knowledge, produced kits or models for garden railways, I had a go at designing, and printing my own. Their short wheelbase van was first, followed by 4-plank, 3-plank and 2-plank open wagons, and a long wheelbase van. Why stop at goods vehicles, I thought. After a fair bit of tinkering, trial, error and improvement, I managed to produce a reasonable working model of a 6-wheel Clemenson balcony coach. The undercarriage had to be tweaked so it can cope with the uneven track and tortuous curves on the Peckforton Light Railway, but it does seem to work. But not everything on the railway in 2020 was 3D printed, some of you will be pleased to hear. I put together a wooden horse-drawn coal dray kit, which had been lounging on the shelf for a few years, and learned all about harnessing horses. A couple of open-topped wagons for sheep were completed. And the Honourable Frances Tolmash has been given her own private rail transport to take her and her current beau to and from Peckforton Castle, thanks to an adapted Sylvanian family's wedding car. And a few incidental sound effects have been added at various appropriate places on the railway, by courtesy of some ridiculously cheap MP3 player gadgets. I did say I was a bit of a fan of technology. And so, as 2020 draws to a close, I wonder what 2021 might bring. Where next, you might ask.